Brian Donlevy, the star, the villain, and the mystery. He was Hollywood's ultimate villain, a man whose presence could send chills down your spine while captivating your attention. With a commanding voice, piercing gaze, and undeniable screen presence, Brian Donlevy built a career portraying some of the most ruthless and unforgettable characters in cinema history. But behind the tough exterior was a man with a life filled with struggle, controversy, and mystery. Today, we uncover the untold story of Brian Donlevy, from his turbulent childhood to his greatest roles, scandalous headlines, and hidden love affairs. This is the real story behind the Hollywood legend. A turbulent childhood. Born in the cold, rolling hills of Portadown, Northern Ireland, on February 9, 1901, Brian Donlevy's early life was far from the glitz and glamour of Hollywood. The youngest of three children, Donlevy's childhood was defined by the hardships of an immigrant family trying to survive in a foreign land. Brian's family made the difficult decision to leave Ireland in search of a better life in America when he was just a toddler. The family settled in Wisconsin, a place far from the booming lights of New York or Los Angeles. But the early days in America were not kind to the Donlevys. The family faced significant challenges, struggling to make ends meet in the industrial heartland of the Midwest. While many children might have grown up in a world of books and play, Donlevy had to learn the harsh realities of life early. As a young boy, he worked various odd jobs to help support his family, from delivering newspapers to laboring in factories. His time spent in those factories would later influence the tough, no-nonsense characters he would play on screen. But while his family struggled to find the stability, Donlevy's personal ambition began to take root. Even in the toughest of circumstances, he dreamed of a better life, one where he could escape the factory floors and find his true calling. By the time he was a teenager, the world was on the brink of the First World War, and the young Donlevy, already shaped by the roughness of his childhood, was ready to take on the world in a new way. In 1917, at the age of 16, Donlevy enlisted in the U.S. Army to fight in World War I. This decision would change his life forever. The war was brutal and unrelenting, a true test of character. Donlevy, like so many young men of his generation, left behind the world he knew and found himself on the front lines of a global conflict. It was there, in the chaos and devastation of war, that Donlevy's ruggedness was solidified. He learned how to survive, how to take on the toughest of challenges, and how to persevere in the face of adversity. The war, though tragic, gave him the resilience and emotional depth that would serve him well in his acting career. He saw things most people would never dream of and experienced the trauma that shaped his worldview. This part of his life would stay with him long after he returned to civilian life. After the war ended in 1918, Donlevy returned to the United States, where he briefly worked as a mechanic. But the pull of the stage was strong. His time spent as a soldier had given him a newfound confidence, and he knew he wanted to take his chances at something bigger: the world of theater and acting. The road to Hollywood was anything but easy, though. Like so many hopefuls, Donlevy struggled to break into the world of acting. But he didn't give up. His time in the Army had forged a new sense of determination within him. He eventually made his way to New York City, where he started taking on small roles in theater productions, learning the craft of acting on stage before making his way to the silver screen. But even as he found his footing in New York, his early life was never far from his mind. Donlevy's rise from a working-class immigrant family to a soldier and then an aspiring actor was a testament to his unyielding spirit. It was this very same drive that would propel him into the heart of Hollywood, where he would soon become one of the most memorable screen villains the world would ever know. From the factories of Wisconsin to the battlefields of Europe, and finally to the glamorous streets of Hollywood, Brian Donlevy's journey was just beginning, breaking into Hollywood in iconic roles. In the early 1930s, Brian Donlevy finally made his way to the heart of Hollywood, where dreams were made and often broken. But Donlevy wasn't a typical starlet hoping to land a contract. No, he was different. His tough, rugged exterior and commanding presence made him stand out from the crowd. And he wasn't just here to play the leading man. He was here to change the game. It didn't take long for Donlevy to find his place in Hollywood. His first roles were minor, But even in these early appearances, he showed the kind of intensity and complexity that would later define his career. He wasn't interested in playing the nice guy. Instead, he gravitated toward characters with a bit of a darker edge. In 1939, everything changed. This was the year that Donlevy would land the role that would make him a household name. He was cast as the brutal and calculating Sergeant Markov in the classic adventure film Beau Geste. In Beau Geste, Donlevy's portrayal of Sergeant Markov was the stuff of legend, a cruel, cold-hearted character who brought tension and suspense to every scene he was in. Donlevy's ability to embody such a villainous role made him an immediate standout, earning him not only recognition, but also an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor. What made Donlevy's portrayal of Markov so striking wasn't just the character's villainous nature, it was the complexity of the role. Donlevy wasn't just playing a one-dimensional bad guy. Markov was a man full of contradictions, cold but desperate, evil but vulnerable. And Donlevy tapped into every layer of that character, making him both unforgettable and terrifying. But Donlevy wasn't just a villain. He could do so much more. In 1940, he starred in another iconic role in The Great McGinty, directed by Preston Sturges. This time, Donlevy wasn't the villain. He was the corrupt politician who would stop at nothing to climb to the top. Unlike the ruthless characters he often played, Donlevy's portrayal of the cynical politician McGinty was filled with sly humor and sharp wit. His performance helped shape the film's satirical tone, with Donlevy bringing just the right touch of darkness to the character without going overboard. It was a role that showcased his versatility and proved that he was more than just the menacing figure the public had come to know. This film was significant not just for Donlevy's performance, but for the recognition it garnered. The movie became a critical success, and Donlevy's portrayal of McGinty earned him praise from both critics and audiences alike. The role also helped to solidify Donlevy's place as one of Hollywood's most intriguing and versatile actors. But it wasn't just his choice of roles that made Donlevy stand out. It was his on-screen presence. There was something magnetic about him. His deep voice, his chiseled features, and his commanding gaze all combined to create a man who, despite playing often unsavory characters, exuded a quiet charisma. He wasn't just a bad guy. He was the kind of villain who made you understand their motivations, even if you hated their actions. Throughout the 1940s, Donlevy continued to diversify his career, playing everything from a nightclub owner to a detective and even a military officer. His deep understanding of human nature and his ability to bring nuance to every role made him a sought-after actor in a time when the silver screen was ruled by bigger-than-life personalities. But what really set Donlevy apart was his ability to command attention, no matter the size of the role. Whether he was playing a supporting character or a lead, his presence was undeniable. There was always a sense that something was simmering beneath the surface. Donlevy's characters were often men at war with themselves, morally conflicted and constantly balancing their darker impulses with moments of vulnerability. Donlevy didn't just create memorable characters. He shaped how audiences saw the archetype of the Hollywood villain. Before Donlevy, the bad guy was often a cartoonish figure with no depth or motivation. But Donlevy's villains were real. They had motives, desires, and emotions that made them feel human, even when they were at their worst. Scandals and dark sides of his career. For all the fame, for all the success, there was a darker side to Brian Donlevy's Hollywood journey. Behind the bright lights and camera flashes, his career was marred by scandal, controversy, and his complicated relationships with co-stars and directors. The man who played such powerful, menacing figures on screen had his own demons off-screen, and it wasn't long before the press began to take notice. From the very beginning of his Hollywood career, Donlevy's reputation as a difficult actor on set was well known. He was not one to shy away from conflict. He was a man with a vision for his roles, and if that vision didn't align with a director or a fellow actor, you could expect fireworks. On many sets, Donlevy's intensity was both an asset and a liability. He was known for having a volatile temper and wasn't afraid to speak his mind, even if it ruffled feathers. Stories from his co-stars and crew members suggest that Donlevy was prone to loud arguments, especially when it came to artistic disagreements. His stubbornness could often create tension on set. One of the most infamous stories comes from the set of The Great McGinty in 1940. Donlevy, a man notorious for his fiery disposition, reportedly clashed with director Preston Sturges on multiple occasions. According to sources, Donlevy didn't always see eye to eye with Sturges' comedic style, and the two had several heated exchanges. Despite these clashes, Donlevy's acting always remained top-notch. He gave everything to his roles, pouring his own frustrations and emotional baggage into his performances. However, not every director appreciated his dedication. His commitment to his craft came at a cost, leading some to label him as difficult. For some, it was a bridge too far. But the tension didn't end with his on-set antics. The press was more than happy to turn the spotlight on Donlevy's personal life, and rumors about his behavior off-camera spread like wildfire. Donlevy's reputation for being difficult wasn't just confined to the film sets. His personal life, particularly his romantic relationships, made plenty of headlines as well. Donlevy had a notorious reputation as a womanizer, with numerous affairs rumored to have taken place during his years in Hollywood. Despite being married to actress Marjorie Lane for a number of years, rumors constantly swirled around Donlevy's personal life. There were whispers of relationships with other leading ladies, including some of the biggest stars of the time. Some suggested that Donlevy's marriage was merely a facade, a way to maintain his image as a leading man, while his heart and his affections were elsewhere. The press was ruthless, and the strain between his professional career and personal life grew ever more apparent. As Donlevy became one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood, the weight of his scandals seemed to overshadow his accomplishments. The tension between his public persona and private struggles became increasingly difficult to ignore. By the mid-1940s, Donlevy's career had begun to plateau as his personal life became more and more intertwined with his professional identity. His reputation for being difficult to work with, combined with the media's obsession with his personal life, caused some directors to hesitate before casting him in lead roles. The industry was starting to evolve, and the rough-hewn, rugged image Donlevy had cultivated wasn't as appealing as it once had been. But even in the face of scandal, Donlevy's skill and presence on screen could never be denied. While he may have been labeled difficult, he remained one of the most charismatic and intriguing actors of his time. His ability to create morally complex characters, often painted in shades of gray rather than black and white, made him a unique figure in Hollywood. While some directors and producers turned away from him due to his personal controversies, others appreciated his talent and the authenticity he brought to every role. Donlevy wasn't just playing the characters, he was living them. Every performance felt lived in, as though he were channeling his own struggles and complexities into the roles he took on. But the question remains, was Donlevy's success worth the toll it took on his personal life? The answer is complex. On one hand, his scandals and tumultuous relationships undoubtedly contributed to his reputation. But on the other hand, they gave him the emotional depth and raw intensity that made his performances unforgettable. Without his turbulent personal life, would he have been able to deliver such emotionally charged performances? Perhaps those struggles, though they were a burden, also became the fuel for the fire that made Donlevy a Hollywood legend. The later years, legacy, and final curtain. As the years passed and the bright lights of Hollywood began to fade for many of its golden age stars, Brian Donlevy found himself in a transitional phase. By the 1950s, the world around him had changed. The studio system that had once made him a star was slowly crumbling, and the style of filmmaking he'd helped define was evolving. Donlevy was no longer the rising, iconic figure he had been in the 1930s and 1940s. But that didn't mean his legacy was any less powerful. The 1950s brought with it a new wave of talent, and with that, new challenges for actors like Donlevy. The tough, rugged characters that had once made him a star seemed to be losing their place in a changing industry. The rise of method acting, with its focus on emotional depth and realism, was replacing the more stylized performances that had characterized the golden age of Hollywood. Yet despite these shifts, Donlevy continued to act well into the 1960s, carving out a niche for himself in television and supporting roles. In a way, his ability to adapt to the changing times showed the resilience that had defined him throughout his career. Though the leading roles were becoming less frequent, Donlevy found new avenues for his talents in the world of television. His rugged, authoritative presence made him a perfect fit for TV dramas and westerns. In television, Donlevy found a home where his presence, his commanding voice, and his ability to infuse authority into every role were highly valued. Shows like The Outer Limits and The Twilight Zone saw Donlevy as a guest star, playing a variety of complex and mysterious characters. Though he was no longer the leading man of old, his performances were still as magnetic as ever. However, with age came a different kind of challenge. Donlevy's health began to decline in the 1960s, and his later years were marked by a growing isolation from the very industry that had once adored him. As Hollywood continued to evolve, so did the public's view of its aging stars. Donlevy was no longer the dashing, charismatic figure he once was. He became, in the eyes of many, a relic of a bygone era. But as we look back on Donlevy's legacy, it's impossible to deny his lasting influence on the silver screen. While his time in the spotlight may have been waning, his contributions to film were indelible. He was one of the true hard-boiled men of early Hollywood, a stalwart in the genre of tough guy roles that defined an entire era of film. Donlevy wasn't just a tough guy, he was a man who brought vulnerability to his roles, making his villains and anti-heroes more relatable. Whether he was a soldier, a corrupt politician, or a scorned lover, Donlevy imbued each character with depth and complexity. His characters weren't just evil for the sake of being evil. They had reasons, motivations, and backstories that made them memorable long after the final credits rolled. Brian Donlevy's ability to bring complexity to his roles is what has made his work so enduring. He wasn't just playing the villain, he was often playing the villain with a story, a heart, and a deep sense of personal conflict. This is what set him apart in an era full of one-dimensional characters. He wasn't just a product of his time, he was a trailblazer who helped redefine what it meant to be a leading man in Hollywood. Sadly, the end came quietly. On April 5, 1972, Brian Donlevy passed away at the age of 71. He had lived a life full of challenges, triumphs, and the kind of complexity that only a man like Donlevy could fully embrace. As his time in the spotlight had faded, the man himself had grown even more enigmatic. Hollywood had moved on, but Donlevy's legacy remained. Though he may not be as widely remembered today as some of his contemporaries, Brian Donlevy's impact on the world of film cannot be overstated. He was one of the original tough guys of Hollywood, a man who built his reputation on grit, intensity, and a sense of moral ambiguity that captivated audiences for decades. In every film, in every role, Donlevy's presence was undeniable, and even though he is no longer with us, his legacy lives on, in the unforgettable characters he brought to life, and in the lasting impact he had on the history of cinema. Brian Donlevy may have stepped away from the spotlight, but his final curtain was one that will never be forgotten. So as we remember Brian Donlevy today, let us not just think of the controversies, the scandals, and the tough guy roles. Let us remember the man complex, passionate, and fiercely committed to his craft. His contributions to Hollywood will echo in eternity, reminding us that the true measure of a star is not just how brightly they shine, but the legacy they leave behind. As Hollywood evolved, Donlevy adapted. Though he was no longer the leading man, he continued acting in film and television, leaving behind a legacy that would endure beyond his final curtain call. Brian Donlevy passed away in 1972, closing the chapter on a life filled with highs and lows. He may have been Hollywood's most infamous villain, but he was also a man of extraordinary talent, resilience, and mystery. His legacy lives on, a testament to the power of cinema and the unforgettable characters that define it. What do you think about Brian Donlevy's life and career? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more Hollywood legends and untold stories.